Well, since I'm not hearing opposition, I think we're just going to make a start also by recording this session. Like I was saying earlier on, I'm running like maybe 2, 3 minutes a little later than normally. We have some AC issues at the campus, so I was just attending to those. But we're going to move ahead with our session. Just because I was kind of going back and forth and I don't think I gave a good answer, I want to clarify there was a question whether what kind of classes are being taught in the fall. At the moment, I'm not scheduled to teach 202 online, but we're always happy to make changes to what's on our calendars and what's on the plans if students have needs or requests. So I will be sharing probably later tonight or later this week for sure contact details for my supervisor if you want to ask a certain instructor to be staffed in certain sessions or certain sections. We totally can do that, and we do actually try to facilitate that for our students. So first of all, I'm very, very grateful for all of you. You survived last week, which was quite an intense week, I'm going to be honest. Hopefully it makes you feel better that you know that from this point onwards, everything else is going to be lighter than that. We're moving to our final larger section of material, which is looking at nervous system. And I'm going to share a couple of things about that in just a bit. But as always, I do have a plan for this session. So I kind of wanted to start by putting things in a bigger scale. I wanted to share with you about a short survey that I've shared also on the Canvas, and then kind of introduce ourselves to nervous system and for the assignments that we have for this week. I also wanted to mention a couple of words about what to anticipate for the next week. And then if we do have time, we'll also kind of outline what were the highlights from this week's learning material. So that was my plan, but that doesn't mean that the plans would not be flexible. So if you do have any questions, if you have anything that comes up, you want to kind of change the path, I am very, very happy to do so. These sessions are really for students to be so that they're meaningful and they're useful. So if at any point you have things that you want us to talk about or look at, don't hesitate either dropping them to the chat or just unmuting yourself and sharing with me. So I'm going to start selfishly by sharing kind of an update where I'm at personally with and professionally with our course. First of all, I'm incredibly grateful for having so great students and for the great work that you're sending in. At the same time, I will share, and I kind of try not to overshare, but I will share that I've spent yesterday with a family member who was at the hospital, and I am attending to those needs throughout probably rest of the week. So there is a chance that I have not been quite as quick to respond as I normally am, but I was just before this session working on our Canvas course, and I think I'm on top of the messages. But if you've sent me a message, for example, regarding missed assignments and wanting to get those reopened, and I haven't answered to you yet, stay on track. I will respond. I'm not ignoring you. I'm just having to kind of go through the list of things that have piled up, and I will get those done. If for some reason my response is delayed, that will never negatively impact you. I will always give you the time that I've been delayed from responding in the time that you can submit work. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that of my own situation, but also realizing for everyone else in this class that I realize life happens. And remember what you're doing. You're already so far on this course. You're already seeing the finish line. So what you can do is all you have to do. You don't need to burn yourself out. You do not need to make yourself sick because you're working so hard. I'm here to support you and work with you. So all you have to do is let me know what I can do to assist. The second slide, I think, captures the same thing. Like I said, it's been a hectic semester. I don't always emphasize it probably enough for my students, but I do tend to front load my courses. So the fact that you're here at this time and this place means that you've gotten through the biggest hurdles of this course. We literally have only one larger of a set of topics, which is looking at the nervous system to go. And we have only one more exam and only one more practical to do. So you're really at the finish line. I am going to be honest, I think that last week was a little heavier than I would like my classes to be. So I might need to look at that for the next semester, that how we restructure things. But kudos to you for making it. Kudos for you still sticking around. These accelerated summer classes are intense and you're rising to the occasion. So what I'm just trying to say is that I appreciate each of you, and please don't give up. Let's stay on the track and let's finish off strong and get you those great final grades that you totally have deserved. So let's have a look where we're at with our course. For the rest of the course, what we'll be looking at is going to be nervous system. So we'll start this week by talking a little bit of kind of an introduction to nervous system, and we'll also spend time talking about the central nervous system. Central nervous system is probably the part that students are most often interested and most knowledgeable. So we'll be talking about the brain. We'll be talking a little bit about the spinal cord. And then in the coming weeks, we'll talk about the rest of the structures of the nervous system. We'll talk about peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and finish off by talking about special senses. And then at the very end of the semester, we'll finish off our last set of tests. So we'll do our exam 3 and practical 3. So I hope that that makes you feel good to see how far you already are. And I hope that that makes you feel that this final amount of the material is doable. So the other thing that I wanted to share is, and I was kind of going back and forth whether I shall do one of these, and I decided to go ahead and do that. I've also shared on your Canvas course right before this week's learning materials at the end of, I believe, tests 2, so exam 2 and practical 2. There's another learning module which just says midterm feedback. I know that we're kind of over the midterm, but I think it's still a good time and good way for us to kind of touch base. I do want my students to share what's working and what's not working, also in these live online sessions, messaging me and so on. But sometimes students are shy. So that's why I also want to provide you an anonymous form through which you can give me feedback. I'm really looking to kind of keep doing what's working well and maybe trying something new for some things that might be a word of kind of exploring a little bit more and changing around. I will share that this feedback also goes to my supervisors. So again, please don't say anything that you wouldn't say to a real person in person, especially if it's in terms of how to word things. So my bosses also look at this feedback. In order to kind of incentivize and remember again, there is never live or never you have to do something or it will negatively impact you on this course. That's not the way I teach. But in order to incentivize for anyone who completes this survey, I also provide extra credit for it. So because it's an anonymous survey, I won't see who has completed it. But once you submit the survey, there will be like a final page where it says that you have completed the survey. Thanks for doing so. I'm asking students to take a screenshot of that, or if you're not able to take a screenshot, you can use even your own phone to grab a picture of that. And if you upload that to the midterm feedback assignment area, I will be sure to give you extra credit for doing. If you miss taking the screenshot, if you miss taking a picture of completing the survey, you can simply type in the day and time when you completed the survey to a text box and submit it to me, and I will still be certain to give you extra credit. So just sharing that I have read and I will keep reading those very carefully. I think there's been some great ideas, and then there's been some great things that we will definitely keep doing. Like I said, I've been teaching for a while. I have strengths, I have also weaknesses, and I'm always open for feedback. So I appreciate when you guys tell me what's working and where can we do even better. So I guess that I'll leave it to there. Like I said, I will address the feedback a little bit more as we move ahead in terms of if I'm introducing new things or changing things around. But I think that at large, it seems that we're on a good path and we'll just keep working like this. So one of the things I've been doing recently is kind of pulling quotes from one of the Asian philosopher called Pueblo, and what he shares with us. And the quote that kind of jumped out when I picked up a random page for us for this week goes that I closed my eyes to look inward and found a universe waiting to explore. Well, I thought that that was a very, first of all, a very poetic thought, but I thought it was very fitting for what we'll be spending rest of our semester together. So what we'll be doing, we'll be talking about nervous system, and how I really kind of pieced this quote together with nervous system was with the next slide. What we see on this slide is a human nervous system. So we see brain, we see spinal cord, and then we see some of the major nerves lined out. Obviously, this doesn't cover everything, but this gives us an idea of the structures that we're working. When I teach this class in a face-to-face format, I normally try to bring in a brain to the class, and I share with students maybe a little bit of confrontationally or maybe a little bit of thought-provokingly that this is all we are, and everything else in our body is just casing, packaging, and support structures. And what I mean by that is that really we all have slightly different experience of the world where we live in. We all have slightly different experiences of even the facts around us. And then obviously deeper and more personal thoughts vary. And what we see, what we experience, how we sense the world is a creation of our nervous system. My background, like I shared with you at the beginning of the course, is partially also on fine arts. And one of the things that I always think about that we go to art museums and we look at, for example, paintings and we say, this is a great painting. There's great colors. But the reality is that we all see slightly different colors. We all perceive the relationships of those colors slightly differently. Yet we can, as a group of people, as a group of species, agree, maybe more culturally agree that something's nice, something's pleasant to look at. And that's where I think the nervous system comes in. I love what Jason has shared, that we are basically all flying spaghetti monsters. If you look at all the nerves that have been dissected, by the way, very skillfully, it does look like a bundle of spaghetti. That's what we are. Kind of also, maybe I'm going a little bit too deep with that quote, but our fears, our worries are also, I guess, in a way created by us, but also positive things that happen are our creations. So I think that that's an interesting thought. I think that that's something where we could unpack it way further. One of the fields that I look into and that I work not in relation to this course is medical law and bioethics. And what we see is that we have a lot of debates that what is the human and what does the future of the medical technologies look. And some people have proposed that as long as we can preserve your brain, we have preserved what essentially is you, since everything else is support structures and packaging parts. I will say to that I do think that it's a little bit of a provocative statement. I think many students, many people find joy and happiness in taking care of their body, in things that they are able to do with their body. So maybe the life isn't quite as dark and black and white as I presented it. But something to consider. I think it's an interesting thought, and it definitely tells why we need to spend time thinking about this series of following chapters. So having said all that, let's have a look what we've got lined up for this week. And first thing that I hope that you'll notice is that it is not as heavy as last week was. So we're looking at two chapters, chapters 12 and partially also chapter 14. I've kind of picked and chosen different pieces from different chapters. And for those chapters, we have quiz, we have practice anatomy, and we have discussion. So in comparison to everything you've done in the previous weeks, I would hope that this week is maybe a little lighter. And I would hope that you get to enjoy of this long weekend and celebrations and have a little bit of a chance to have a break in that sense. So that's my plan. I'm asking that you submit those assignments by the end of the week. So Sunday, 1 minute before midnight is when the assignments close. But as I've said before, if you have missed due dates, I am willing on case-by-case basis to figure out what we can do to help you. Remember also that you don't need to have 100% for everything. You just need to have 91% to get an A and 81 to get a B, and so on and so on. There's many ways of earning points, so you choose what works for you. So I think that that outlines kind of the assignments for this week. I guess I could say in terms of discussions that what we're going to be doing what we've been doing already for a few weeks, that I'm asking in total 2 posts in each forum. So 2 posts for chapter 12 discussion and 2 posts for chapter 14 discussion, if you want full marks. The first post, it can be more of a kind of a self-driven reflections on the material or highlighting aspects that you were interested. And the second post, I hope, is more of kind of in response to one of your peers. Having said that, I think that that's a great chance for us to talk about next week as well. And the reason why I want to share about next week with you is that it's going to be a little bit of a different week. So I am sent for a work trip by our employer. So I'm not on a holiday, but I will be working, but I will be out of state for duration of the next week, starting actually this Sunday. Maybe towards end of the next week, I'll be back. So I will be working. I will be busy full time. Full day. So my ability to respond to messages might be limited, but I will every night make sure that I'm available and I log into our course. So I will be responding. I will be interacting if you have sent messages to as much as I can, and I will be available. But because there is a time zone difference, and I haven't quite yet figured out what the time zone difference is, and like I said, I'm required to work full working hours, it is not going to be feasible for us to have our live online sessions next week. I simply cannot get away from the work duties that I have been assigned. So what I'm going to do instead is that I'm going to record kind of one of these sessions, and I'm going to make that available for you for the next week. However, if you do have questions, it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be there to answer. We just won't be able to do it in live setting like this. You can still message to me and we will figure it out. In relation to that, I did want to kind of preface what I'm looking for next week in our discussion forums. So you might have noticed that I'm pretty active on our discussion forums. I try to make sure that I answer to every student who has participated at least once. So next week, that's not going to be feasible. So what I'm doing is that I'm giving the charge of leading discussions to the students. So rather than waiting necessarily for me to interact or send prompts or so on, I'm asking that you kind of drive the discussion yourself as a class. So I would encourage, and I probably will, I still haven't quite decided how I'm going to grade the next week's assignment in terms of the discussion forum, but what I'm envisioning at the moment is that I'm expecting every student to ask some question or questions from their peers. And I'm expecting every student who wants full marks also to answer at least one of the questions. So we're kind of moving away. You noticed at the beginning of the course, all you had to do was one post. Then it grew into a couple of posts. And now, since I'm going to be busy, but also since I want you to have more of an ownership of your classroom, virtual classroom, you will be driving the discussion next week. I will still be grading those. I will still be providing feedback, but it might not be as immediate and it might not be as detailed as it has been in the previous weeks. So just kind of putting that out there. I don't want you to be stressed. I don't want you to be worried, but just so you know what to anticipate for the next week. At this point, I guess it's a good time for me to pause and check that. Is everyone good? Does anyone have any questions about that? Anyone who kind of feels like, oh, that was a curveball? I don't want you to worry about next week. Like I said, I will always start the week with a post sharing what's expected, how we're going to be doing assignments, what's the expectation for the assignments. But I'm seeing on the chat that it sounds all good, and I appreciate that. Excellent. Well, I appreciate it. Like I said, I wish it was a holiday trip, but the reason why I shared that it's a trip, because sometimes things happen with the flights, and if things were to happen with the flights, and I wouldn't be back as quickly as I'm anticipating. I just wanted you to know that I haven't disappeared from the Earth. So what I was gonna do is that I was gonna provide kind of a short summary of some of the highlight or some of the key points on this week's chapter. So let's have a look of a little bit, kind of, I'm always starting wide and then zooming in, and why nervous system is so important. And we kind of already touched upon that a little bit, but I'll bring in a little different perspective. If any of you have taken psychology classes, you might be familiar with the work of neurologist Oliver Sacks. Oliver Sacks is a pretty famous figure in the field of neurology, in the field of psychology, and in the field of neurobio. What he has done, he has worked a lot in clinical work with patients who have either brain injuries or have otherwise curious, complex cases in that. And one of the books that he has published is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And this is actually in reference to one of the case stories that he shares in that book about Dr. P, who was his patient. And Dr. P suffered what's known as visual agnosia. So what that means is that there was nothing wrong with this patient's vision or even intelligence. So everything was working well. But something somewhere along the pathway came about that made things a little bit curious. So the part where you have seen something, your eyes have detected, converted in the case of vision, light waves into neural impulses that have then passed to your brain, to the areas that process those impulses and give a meaning to what you're saying. Somewhere along on that recognition pathway, something went wrong, and he had tendency to have impairments in his recognition of objects that were presented to him. And one of the objects that he perceived as something else than what it was in fact his wife. And they had been married for a long time, but when he looked at his wife, what he saw was a hat. And what he was going to do then, since being a person of a certain era when hats and men wearing hats was much more common, he thought that, well, I should put that hat on a shelf in my house, since I'm not using the hat at the moment. Obviously, the wife kind of objected to that, and that's the story, and that's the kind of clinical case scenario that Oliver Sacks unpacks. So interesting stories if you're looking for summer read. What we learned in relation to Dr. P was that actually his occipital lobe and part of his temporal lobe were damaged. And because of that, that recognition part of the vision, recognition part of processing visual information did not work correctly. So kind of a curious case scenario. Another case that I wanted to share with you is in relation to Phineas Gage. And again, many of you who have taken psychology classes might have met this case before. So Phineas was an American railroad construction foreman, and he was of an era when working on railroad required, obviously, then removing some of the rock material from the way of the railroad. In fact, I don't know how much you know about railroad constructions, but railroads typically have to be running fairly flat. It's rare that we would see very steep climbs or steep hills that railroads come down. So we need to kind of provide fairly stable and fairly flat surfaces that the trains travel. Well, in order to do that, we need to remove significant amounts of rocks. And at this era, how that was done, and partially how it's done these days as well, but I guess more of on the days gone by, was by drilling holes to the rock material, filling it with black powder, and then exploding it. So that's how we were able to remove some of that stone rock material out of the way. Well, techniques have definitely improved. And what was happening is that we did have one of those holes drilled into the rock, and Phineas was filling that with black powder, and he was doing that with a metal rod that helps to kind of compress it down into that hole. And as he was doing so, the metal hitting against the rock resulted in a spark, which then obviously resulted in that black powder in the hole exploding, which then resulted in that metal part that he was working on flying violently out of that hole. And then metal bar was actually underneath his chin when he was working on. So this metal bar ended up flying through and penetrating through his skull, penetrating through his frontal lobe, and coming out from the other end. And interestingly enough, Phineas didn't die as a result of this. He did have injury, and you can see a picture of him on the screen, and you can see that there is some damage, but nothing too dramatic, but some damage that we can see as a result of this accident. Phineas went to live on for another 12 years or so. What was interesting, though, was that the people who knew Phineas said that this accident profoundly changed him, and not necessarily for the better. Phineas had been described before his accident as a very calm and very relaxed, very laid-back guy, and now he was easily irritated, fairly temperamental, kind of harder to get along. So the friend said, and I'm quoting here from my notes, that he was no longer the Gage they knew. So personality and his behavior changed as a result of this accident. And this again, I guess, speaks volumes to the brain accidents and how we have learned about the different roles of the different parts of the brain largely through accidents, and studying individuals who have had weird personalities or weird things happening, and then studying their nervous system after they have passed away. I will add to this that these days we can gain a tremendous amount of knowledge about nervous system and also about injuries, but also about extremely talented and skilled people with cognitive neural imaging. So we can take images from living persons without interfering with their bodies, of their anatomical structures of their brain, but also the physiology of their brain. One of the things that we do is that we inject contrast agent into bloodstream, and we see where there's elevated blood flow on someone's brain and on certain areas of the brain. I've done a fair amount of work on that field. So we would ask a patient, for example, in a functional MRI scanner to be performing a task. It could be a visual task, it could be an auditory task, it could be a physical task. And then we would look what parts of the brain are lighting up in terms of that there's more oxygen or there's more blood flow, in signifying that there's more oxygen consumption, which signifies that there's more activity on that area. So that's how we've gotten a lot of knowledge and still get. And just like Jason shared in the chat, we do see that in fact certain drugs, especially recreational use of drugs, can cause profound changes in person's personality and their ability to function in their behavior and so on. So we kind of have to be mindful about that. And I always warn that even though some people might have positive experiences of using recreational drugs, there's a reason why they're not available in a medical sense, because there is, for example, recreational drug use related psychosis that happens sometimes, and sometimes it's reversible, sometimes it's not reversible. So very good example of that, Jason. I'm kind of more of a 90s, 80s kid. Back then, one of the things, and I'm by no means encouraging to you to do that, is that kids were breeding markers and breeding glues to get kind of this high feeling. And we have later on found out that that causes pretty horrendous damage, not just to the respiratory system, but also to the brain. So again, if you're seeking for recreational states of alteredness, try to do those through approved methods. Yeah, huffing. See, I don't have all the terminology. I wasn't living in English-speaking countries at that time, but yep, sounds about right. So I guess that was my introduction to nervous system, why nervous system is so interesting, why there's so much to be found, still to be found about nervous system, how nervous system works, and even about anatomy of nervous system. So if you're looking at a field where you can venture into unknown territory and do some discoveries, I really do encourage you to look into neuromedicine, things like that. Let me just take a moment. I'm going to add, we have one more attendee joining us. I just try to keep a list of who's present so I can give everyone extra credit. But if anyone has great stories or comments, feel free to just drop them to the chat or unmute. So I think that gets us kind of oriented why I think our good justification why nervous system is so incredibly important to us. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about the functions of the nervous system. So nervous system is one of the two communication systems in your body. And we will finish this semester or this course together by talking about nervous system, and you will start your BIO202 course by talking about the second communication system, which is our endocrine system. What nervous system and endocrine system do, they control all other body systems. So they're really the regulatory systems, they're the master systems in that sense. How messages travel in nervous system is as electrical messages, as nerve impulses, or we'll talk about action potentials within neurons, and also as chemical messages from one nerve cell to another nerve cell, or from a nerve cell to another organ or another structure like neuromuscular junction, like we saw last week. So we have both electrical and chemical messages taking place in nervous system. What's really striking about nervous system is that these messages are incredibly fast. So these messages travel in less than a second. So we're talking about milliseconds from one body part to another body part. Even these chemical messages within the synapses, which are the endings of the nerve cells, they don't take a long time to pass. So we see almost immediate responses. When you get to BIO202, and I don't want you to worry about it yet, you will see that endocrine system instead is much slower. We do have some very quick hormones that create quick changes in your body, but some hormones can take weeks, if not even months, to start to have an effect in our body. So that's why I really always enjoy this comparing and contrasting nervous system and endocrine system. So I think that's one way to look at it. One thing that I would probably add to this slide, now that I'm looking at it, I would also add that nervous system messages are also typically very, very specific. They start from one specific part and go to another specific part and have a specific impact on those targets. In comparison, endocrine system hormones, they travel throughout your entire body in your cardiovascular system, and why not even in your lymphatic system. So the effects are much more global than those that we see with nervous system. So that's one way to look at nervous system. The other way to look at nervous system is to look at three functions that nervous system has. And all of these three functions have actually overlap with each other. So let's unbundle nervous system functions through that. First thing that we're seeing there is that nervous system is responsible for collecting sensory input. So it's really gathering that information through your sensory organs. This information might be about external world, so it might be that we're looking what's happening around us, but information can be also internal. So we have many sensory endings, sensory organs, sensory receptors also inside our body, constantly monitoring what's happening in our body. If you think of the concept of homeostasis, we really see that there. So some of the sensory organs we could again think of, for example, your smell and taste, your sight, your hearing, your balance, your touch, your body position, things like that. We're constantly collecting information about that with the nervous system, that the portion of the nervous system that focuses on this sensory input. The second function of the nervous system is actually kind of more of an integration type of a function. So we're processing and interpreting the information that we collect. In fact, we receive so much sensory information that we can never be aware of all of that all at one time. So we need to choose where we direct our attention, and then the information that we get, we have to integrate it to create whole experience of the world. We have to choose what matters, what doesn't matter. We have to maybe combine multiple senses and the information that we receive through multiple senses and make a kind of holistic view, holistic experience of that. We might also make choices based on the information that we are receiving. Do we want to act on that information, or do we say that, well, this information exists, but we don't really care about it or act on it at this moment? Well, if we choose to act on the information that we have collected and received, that's when the motor output function of the nervous system steps in. So we have effectors. Typically, these could be muscles, these could be glands in your body, and we respond to what we kind of have integrated and made a decision how to act based on that by doing some kind of a motor output. So those are the three functions of the nervous system. And you can see that each one of these kind of relies on the other systems. Typically, the integration of the information takes place at the level of the brain, which we'll be looking at today, but also some of the integration could happen on lower levels, like at the level of the spinal cord, like is the case in case of reflexes. So I think that the reason why I really like about this way of considering nervous system and functions of the nervous system is that it brings us back to something that we have seen before. And I don't know if anyone has already an immediate thought where the story might go next. Feel free to drop it to the chat or unmute yourself, or I can also share it. But let's give a moment. What does all of this remind us about? Reminds us about a concept we've seen before. Well, I would propose that it reminds us probably about our homeostatic feedback mechanism. So you remember how I said that I want you to learn the homeostatic feedback mechanism loop because it's so important. Well, this is one of the times that we start to see where it really becomes useful. So the stimulus and sensors or receptors would really refer to the sensory function of nervous system. The control center and set point there is really this integration portion made by, mainly conducted at the level of the brain. And the effectors would be our motor output in response to that stimulus. So I think that it's kind of cool to see that we have all these systems, find nuances, but if we really look at it, it always tends to come back to homeostasis. So that's kind of, I guess, one way to consider nervous system. Other way to consider nervous system is divided into different sections. And this is in fact the approach that we will take for the rest of the semester as we unbundle the nervous system. So we can divide nervous system both functionally and anatomically into two main parts. we have our central nervous system, and central nervous system really covers your brain and your spinal cord. These structures are really our control centers, if you wish. They're responsible for that integration, that analysis of information, giving meanings to the information that we receive, and maybe even doing decisions on the information that we have. So we start our discovery of the nervous system for the rest of the semester with the central nervous system. We also have what's known as peripheral nervous system. Peripheral nervous system covers all parts of your nervous system that are not part of the central nervous system. So it's all these nerves that extend both from the brain and from your spinal cord. These would be either called as cranial nerves from the brain or spinal nerves from the spine. This covers our sensory organs. This covers kind of all of that basic stuff, but also, as we'll see later on this course, some of the more complex, nuanced information. One thing that I kind of like about this division is that it really brings in that form and function again. So we're seeing that our brain and our spinal cord, we're kind of, if you wish to describe them as a computing and processing part of our nervous system. Another interesting thing to notice about, which kind of ties into chapter 1, if you can remember all the way back there, is that both brain and spinal cord are located at our dorsal side of the body. So dorsal body cavities. So that's one definition or division that we can see. Whereas we saw with the peripheral nervous system that this is really, if you wish to describe them in a little bit oversimplifying, but still as communication lines. Both for receiving and sending messages out of our central nervous system. So these were all the parts outside the nervous system, our spinal nerves, our cranial nerves. So they're not going to be housed within our dorsal cavities. So I hope that that kind of helps you to put maybe this division together a little bit. I did want to mention also that one way how we can do this kind of a classification is going back to what we started with, is focus on nervous system as two functional divisions, our sensory nerves or sensory nervous system and our motor nervous system. Sensory nervous system is described as our afferent system. It carries messages into the central nervous system, whereas our motor branch is described as efferent. It carries messages out. So afferent, messages into the central nervous system, and efferent, messages out from the central nervous system. So that's one division that we can do. And as we're kind of exploring that, and we will spend much more time, so don't worry if this doesn't feel yet fully comprehensive, but we will spend much more time also looking at the motor branches. We'll talk about somatic and autonomic nervous system. Somatic is a voluntary system, so it's kind of controlling things like your movements, your actions, whereas autonomic branch is focusing on involuntary responses, kind of automatic responses, if you wish to think about it. We don't have control over those. Those are mainly unconscious. And we can, in fact, divide the autonomic nervous system even further into two branches within the autonomic nervous system. And these two branches are our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. What sympathetic nervous system does, it's sometimes described as our fight or flight responses. So it's our body responding to situations where we might feel threatened, we might feel that our safety, our life is at risk. So you have two options. Either you fight against that risk or you try to escape from that situation. So we see that when sympathetic nervous system is activated, this is really in response to stressful situations, excitement, fears, angers, or even sometimes embarrassment. So we see physiological changes in various body systems in response to that. These could be, for example, your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up. We're starting to direct blood to muscles, especially our skeletal muscles. So blood vessels are dilating, especially those that carry blood to skeletal muscles. So you can fight or you can escape. We're also seeing changes, for example, in our respiratory system and our bronchi dilating so we can get more air, so we can physically fight or flight. Your digestive system instead gets depressed, so we're not using that much. It gets kind of put on the background. We'll come back to it later on. If you're fighting for your survival or escaping for your survival, digestion is probably not at the top of your list in terms of immediate needs in the body. Parasympathetic nervous system instead is sometimes described as our rest and digest branch of the autonomic nervous system. So we see many changes in response to that. Your pupils start to constrict, your heart rate decreases, your blood pressure goes down. Your respiratory system also kind of constricts. It's more of this chilling stage in your life. Interestingly, during the parasympathetic nervous system activation, we do see that your digestive system starts to work harder, your saliva production increases, your urinary system production of feces, all of that goes up. So this is kind of the body's maintenance system when we can kind of just vegetate and direct resources for maintaining our body. How I describe to my students the parasympathetic branch often is to think of how you are on Thanksgiving, after the Thanksgiving meal, when you sit down on a sofa or on a lazy chair or whatever, and you just kind of relax. That's when your parasympathetic nervous system is working hard. When you're in a danger, when you're kind of, for example, have been surprised in traffic and are super alert, that's when your sympathetic nervous system is working hard. So those were, I guess, all of the ways how we can classify nervous system, all of the divisions that I can think of. I hope that that was at least somewhat helpful in terms of kind of having an initial idea of the different parts. What I was going to do next was to go to the basics, and we're going to try something a little bit different, kind of partially also in response to the feedback. Let's have a look of an individual neuron. So neurons are nerve cells, and they're really the fundamental basic units of our nervous system. So we're going to have a different looks of an different parts, look at different parts of an individual nerve cell. And nerve cells come in many different shapes, forms, arrangements. So what we typically tend to teach you is just kind of a generalized model of a neuron. This does not mean that all neurons will have all of the structures that we will be talking about, but your teachers tend to love to show you kind of a general structure that shows you the most important parts that we can see in most of the neurons. But remember, we have different arrangements, we have different appearances. Some neurons have all parts, some neurons have only some of the parts, but we're seeing some of the key structures. If we learn this structure, we're probably well set for the variability of neurons, how they are different. So what we're seeing, and we were seeing before my marker started acting up, is the cell body of a neuron. And on that cell body, we're seeing few different adaptations. So within the cell body, I'm just trying to get some colors so I can maybe make it a little bit more vibrant in that sense. Our cell body contains our nucleus. So remember, most cells had a nucleus, so do neurons. And this nucleus, not only it contains your genetic material, you can consider the cell body, the nucleus also as the part of the neuron where we're processing information. So neuron is processing on a very, very small scale, on a cell scale, the information in your body and choosing what to do. And what the neuron is processing or what information it's collecting is through these structures that we see here. And these are what are known as our dendrites. So dendrites are projections from the cell body of a neuron. And sometimes I describe them to my students as almost like little antennas. So the cell is collecting information from around it and kind of bringing all that information into the cell body. And it is this information that we then have to weigh and kind of analyze. Is there enough information for our neuron to be prompted to do something? Or do we say that this information is really not crucial? We don't need to do anything for that. So that's one of the things that nerve cells do. They are constantly analyzing that information. So I guess for our structures, we could also add the nucleus, I guess. And from the cell body of a neuron, we have a part that comes out. So notice so far, all of these dendrites were bringing information towards the cell body of a neuron. But now this information is actually leaving the neuron. And the information leaves the neuron through a long portion from the neuron, and this portion can carry messages only to one direction, which is away from the neuron. This structure is known as the axon of the neuron. So let's add that to our list of structures. So if the cell body, if the nucleus of the neuron found that it was enough of stimulation for us to do something about it, one of the things that it can choose to do is to start an electrical impulse that's going to propagate along the axon onwards. So we have all kinds of neurons. Some neurons are very small, very short, but we also have neurons that are incredibly long. For example, on your spinal cord, you have neurons that are about 1 meter in length. And it is this axon part that's the long part of these neurons. So we can pass messages from one part of the body to another. I almost would describe these almost like electric wires that we see. So they're carrying those electrical impulses within the nervous system. So one message is from one part to another. Another thing that I wanted to highlight in relation to this neuron, that sometimes along this axon, we see that we have these special structures that are known as myelin. So these are fatty material that has kind of formed, wrapped around this neuron's axon, and it serves few different purposes, but they tend to cover sections of the axon, not necessarily as a continuous, but kind of more of as these blobs. And the two purposes that we see these myelin shells forming, let's unpack that a little bit more. And my family often reminds me, sometimes students in my class, that it's obvious that I'm a guy since I struggle to do two things at the same time. So if I'm taking a pause from talking while I'm trying to draw something, it's simply because I'm not that skilled and I'm trying to focus on something. But please forgive that it's not out of me being lazy. I just want to do a good job with what I'm doing. So sometimes I have to pause. I do actually tell sometimes my family that when I have chewing gum and I have to walk, I have to choose one or another. Doing both at the same time is too much. That's not true, but I like to be a little sassy. So these blue blobs, I guess, on our diagram are those myelin cells that have wrapped around the axon. And myelin differs. We do see, whether we see it in central nervous system or peripheral nervous system, we see a little bit different terminology. But at this level, when we're just kind of grasping these basic concepts, you can just think of it as a fatty material that wraps around the axon, and hopefully in that way is able to kind of secure a portion of that. Let's see if I can tidy up this part that got kind of messy. So what myelin does? Myelin does two things, two main things that I want to talk about. It kind of isolates or insulates the axon, kind of protecting that. And in addition to that, it does something that's going to be super important when we think of the physiology. So earlier on, you saw, oh, I still don't have the right pen. Let's try again. Earlier on, you saw that the messages traveled along the axon. Well, if we have myelin wrapped around the axon, these messages are able to travel even faster than they would in the axon alone. So again, think of that electrical cord where you have plastic insulation around it, and that allows that really to conduct that message easily and quickly. The process how myelin actually speeds up the message within the axon is a little different. The message actually tends to jump from one gap of a myelin shell to another. So these are called little gaps, and the message just kind of bypasses that section of the axon where we had myelin wrapped around it. So the message doesn't need to travel through all of that portion. It just jumps over to the next part. So that's how we can actually speed up messages in neurons as well. When we see at the very end of an axon, let me just get my pencil out. At the very end of an axon, if I find my cursor, sometimes axons have just a single ending. Sometimes they might have branches, and sometimes they divide into multiple different endings. And these are what are known now as axon terminals. So within these axon terminals, the message reaches there, and then the electrical message now causes a change to take place. And this change that takes place is exactly similar to what you saw when we talked about neuromuscular junction, where we had chemicals that were released from these axon terminals. And these chemicals now could then cross over that little gap that we have before the message gets to either to the target or to the next neuron. So we have neurotransmitters in these axon terminals. So that's going to be important for us as well. So these structures where the message ends and the electrical message then causes the signal to be released were known as our axon terminals. So like I said, the neurons can finish with the target organ, whether it's a muscle or whether it's another neuron's dendrite that's collecting information, and then that passes it onwards. But somehow we're exchanging that information here at the axon terminal and at the synaptic cleft area. So those were some of the key parts, I guess, of neuron. This is a generalized model, so obviously we see neurons that might have multiple axons or axon divides. We see neurons where the cell body is located in the middle of an axon. We see neurons that have only one dendrite. We might see neurons that have multiple dendrites. So a lot of variation, but if you know these parts of a neuron, you're well set for understanding any of the version that you might see of a neuron later. So that was the first kind of an important or big concept that I wanted to talk about. The second concept that I wanted to talk about is our glial cells, or sometimes also known as neuroglia. So neuroglia or glial cells are an important part of the nervous system, but they're not neurons actually. They're what's known as supporting cells within the nervous system. So they might support the neurons either physically, by around them, or physiologically, for example, by delivering nutrients, oxygen, removing waste products from neurons. Remember, all cells needed resources. So these glial cells somehow assist our neurons. And there's many different kinds of glial cells, and I thought that it'd be useful for us to go through some of the most important ones of those. So let's start with astrocytes. So astrocytes receive their name from the fact that some have described them looking a little bit like star-shaped cells. So these are glial cells, star-shaped glial cells that play really important role in your metabolism. So what they do, they assist in cellular reactions, cellular processes. And another thing that astrocytes do that I think is worthwhile to notice is that they also can contribute to the production of the myelin. So that's our first glial cell type. The second glial cell type that I wanted to talk about is going to be, and this is a longer word, so I'm going to need a second. So the second glial cell type that I wanted us to discuss today is known as oligodendrocytes. Let me just tidy up that a little bit. So let's discuss a little bit more about those. These are typically, if I get my pointer, glial cells that have a cell body. And then from that cell body comes an expansion. And from that expansion, we see myelin being produced. And typically, this myelin actually wraps around an axon of a neuron. So oligodendrocytes are another glial cell type that's responsible for producing that myelin that's then found around the axon of a neuron. So let's add those. Remember on this drawing, we see the cell body of an oligodendrocyte, and then we see this part that then connects this myelin often comes as kind of a sheath that wraps around this axon, almost like, I don't know what they're called in English, but those cakes that are sheet cakes that you roll up, form kind of a rolled up cake. So that's almost what oligodendrocytes myelin production looks like. The next glial cell that I wanted to mention is going to be our, if I find my cursor, it's going to be called microglia. So what we see here is a couple of things. These are very, very, very small glial cells. Some people describe them as looking almost like spider-like because they have these projections that come out. And like I said, the word micro referring to the fact that they're incredibly small structures. Let's add our microglia to our drawings. What they tend to do, they tend to be phagocytostic cells. So they kind of dispose material, engulf waste material that we want to get rid of and get rid of it. The final glial cell type that I wanted us to look at Has few different spellings or a few different ways how it's written. Whether you call it ependymal cells or ependyma, both would work. But these ependymal cells are their own unique group. And what we see with those is that they typically end up lining up cavities in the body, and they tend to have cilia on their surface. So remember, cilia were those microscopic small projections that we see. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about ependymal cells. What ependymal cells do is that we find them, for example, in your spinal cord and also within the ventricles of your brain, kind of contributing to that blood-brain barrier, separating the parts, for example, your cardiovascular system doesn't carry just blood willy-nilly to the brain. The type of blood that gets to enter to the brain, the pressure of that, removing toxins of that, all of those are important things for us to do so that we protect that incredibly sensitive brain tissue, neurons within there. Like I said, glial cells, or I think I didn't say that, I think I was just posting that to our discussion forum before our session started, is glial cells are supporting cells. And one thing that's interesting is that we have found out that so often in biology, we focus on the kind of superstars when it comes to the structures. And we've focused a lot of resources on studying neurons. But now more research we're doing, we're actually finding that glial cells play just as important role in your nervous system as neurons. For example, many diseases, many illnesses like Alzheimer's, we're finding out that it's not actually so much about the neurons as it is faulty or non-functioning glial cells that contribute to these conditions. So this is, I guess, why I would say that basic research is so incredibly important for us, that we learn about the basic things so that then we can make sense of conditions that might not be exactly what we expect. So that's our glial cells. Next thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is going back to that neuron that I showed you. And I told you that we had, here we have, it's kind of a mirror image. Here we have the neuron, we have the dendrites, we have the cell body, we have nucleus there, and we see an axon coming out of the neuron and going to the axon terminals. I mentioned that the messages pass within the neurons from the cell body towards the axon terminals. And these messages are electrical impulses that travel. Again, I think that that analog of an electrical wire is particularly good here. But we need to understand, how do these electrical impulses, what creates them, and how they pass along in these neurons. So that's what I wanted to focus next in our discussion. And what we'll be looking at is action potentials. Before we have a look what an action potential looks like, let's figure out how we learned this information, that there's electrical messages, electrical currents passing along the axon. Well, how that came about is that we have a technique where we take a very, very, very fine-tipped sensor and we stick that sensor inside the axon. So it goes through the outer wall so that the tip of that sensor is inside the axon. Often this part or this structure is so small, so fine, that we actually need to use almost like a glass rod that we heat up and extend so that it becomes very, very thin, to make a small and tiny enough ending of a microelectrode that we can then get inside the axon so that it doesn't go through, but the tip stays inside there. We do also have a ground electron somewhere outside the cell, and we're comparing the charges between these two electrodes. And what we end up seeing is that the inside of a nerve cell is negatively charged to an amount of negative 70 millivolts. And we'll unbundle what causes that, and we'll also have a look how this negative charge actually changes. It becomes temporarily positive as it travels through the axon of a neuron as we're passing that electrical message. And we'll also unbundle what causes that to happen. So remember that we see that these neurons are highly excitable, so the messages pass through them really, really fast. So let's have a look what we would see if we recorded these charges within an axon from one spot over a time. We would see a graph that would look something like this. And this is what your action potentials typically look like. So what we see is that we have a resting potential, and that resting potential was about negative 70 millivolts. And negative 70 millivolt is really accomplished due to our sodium and potassium pumps and also the movement of calcium to a certain extent. So we're constantly actively pumping potassium, which is positively charged, and the 2 potassium inside the cell, but 3 sodiums out of the cell. Sodium is also positively charged. If you calculate all the pluses and minuses, what we end up seeing is that we're constantly building up a negative charge inside the cell. So that's how we're accomplishing that negative 70 millivolts. We're pumping materials across the cell membrane, and we're establishing a negative charge in relation to the outside of the cell inside the nerve cell. What then happens is that stimulus takes place. So stimulus is a trigger. That something happens that starts an action potential to take place. This could be, for example, stimulus signal for nerve impulse to be started. Or it could be, if we're studying that initial picture that we saw, that an investigator in a lab goes and pokes that nerve cell. So we're somehow getting a stimulus. And once that stimulus happens, we see a set of really rapid changes. The sodium channels to the neuron open up, and sodium rushes inside the cell, bringing that positive charge. And we see that we move away from the negative 70 to our neutral charge, and we even go a little bit overshooting above that 0 charge, so that the insides of the neuron cell, nerve cell, become positively charged. This movement, this change, is known as depolarization. If you're wondering about that word, polarization and depolarization, let's unpack that a little bit. So if we have people who have very polarized views, it means that they are far away from each other. So then depolarized would be that we come close. And what the depolarization now refers is that we're becoming close to 0. We do, in fact, end up going a little bit higher than that. But now the insides of the cell have reached 0, or they have even reached higher than that as a charge, so they've become positively charged. But nerve cell cannot stay in this state forever. What needs to happen eventually is that it has to normalize. And we see that the sodium channels close and potassium channels now open. And to normalize, we're seeing that the membrane potential, the inside of the cell, starts to become negative again. This is what we call repolarization. So we're becoming pack polarized, so far away from 0. And what often happens is that we actually do something known as hyperpolarization. So we go even below that normal resting potential. And this hyperpolarization is important because this is our refractory period. While a neuron is hyperpolarized, another action potential cannot be initiated. So this prevents that we would have action potentials firing like crazy, so that we would not be able to kind of ever get to that normal situation. And sorry, that was my phone warning about a dust storm on this area. I can see already outside. So if anything cuts off, it's not me, it's that we're in the middle of a dust storm. So just so you know, you might see, I don't know if the picture looks a little over inflated, so you might not see actually the dust in the air, but it's definitely windy. But these are the events of an action potential. So sometimes when I teach this, and I think it's important that we learn this and it's important that we discuss this. But I find that sometimes when I teach this to my students, they are left kind of a little bit confused or not totally certain that how does action potential work? So remember that everything that we've been looking at here is a single point on an axon of a neuron. This would happen in a next point and point after that and point after that and point after that. But all of this would happen slightly later than it happened in a previous point. So in this way, the positive charge would travel within the neuron onwards to the end of an axon. Hold on just a second. I can definitely tell the dust in the air. So because we had AC off, they obviously are now working on it, and now all the dust is flying inside the room. So what we see is that the action potential propagates through the action of a neuron from one end to another. So this is how the electrical signals are formed. This is what they are. This is what they do. And if we look this diagram, that's not necessarily the best drawing I've ever provided for you, but I think it's useful for what we're looking. We're seeing that this action potential was happening in each of these spots, one after another, with just a slight delay. And then obviously that spot returns back to that normal negative charge. Now, if we have myelinated axon, we see something very different. We see that this action potential is able to jump all over this myelin sheath to the next myelin sheath gap. And that's where the next action potential takes place. And again, it jumps to the next one. So in this way, the myelin actually speeds up the passage of an action potential within a neuron. And that brings us to the very end of the neuron, to the action terminals. Let's have a look of those a little bit. And what we see here is an actual real action terminal. I sometimes worry when I teach my students that they think that I'm just making up stuff. I certainly am not. This is a real structure that we see. And what we see here is a synapsis. So we see the axon of a neuron, and we see the action terminal. Hold on a second. We have some fighter jets flying, so that's why there's a noise. And then from the action terminal to the next neuron that we want to contact, there's not actually physical connection. There's actually a small gap. And it is this gap where those chemical messengers have to pass that we talked about, for example, in neuromuscular junction, but also at the synapses of other structures. These chemical messages have to cross this so that they can act on the next neuron or on the target organ. So I have kind of a verbal description of everything that we just talked about. So the gap between axon terminal and the target or the next neuron is known as synapsis. And the message and this gap is no longer, that message passes, is no longer electrical action potential. Instead, it's going to be a chemical message. And I think that this picture does a good job of showing. So if you compare this to what we just saw, this is just a diagram that's maybe a little bit cleaner. We see the electrical axon, electrical impulse within the axon passing onwards. We come to the action terminal, and within action terminal, we will find these small vesicles filled with chemicals. And it is these vesicles that fuse as a result of this electrical impulse to the wall of the action terminal and release the chemical contents into the synapsis, which was this gap between the end of a neuron and start of a new neuron or start of a target organ. And it is this chemical message that travels here and then binds to a receptor on the subsequent structure. We do also have a whole set of things that we could look at, how we're removing these chemicals. We can't leave them there, how they have to match with the receptors for them, and how they get deactivated and removed from this space. But for our purposes, I think that this is a pretty good amount of detail for us. As we're looking, we're seeing the electrical impulse coming in that causes changes in the chemicals, that causes us to release these vesicles and their contents into the synaptic. that then triggered a next message that passed onwards. So that brings us to the end of chapter 12. We still have a little bit more to talk about chapter 14, but what I was going to do at this point, because I'm going to be honest, since we don't have AC, it is becoming a little bit unbearably warm. So I'm going to open up my door just so that I'm not going to be struggling with or sweating as much or nothing else unpleasant. So just give me a second. I will continue with chapter 14 in just a second. Okay, here we are back at the at our presentation, and what we're going to do next is that I think we should talk about chapter 14. Unless anyone has any burning questions, obviously I don't want you to feel that you can't ask things. Oh, I appreciate you saying that you're okay watching a recording. I'm just going to go through it. I think it's going to be easier, but I just wanted to justify if I look like I'm uncomfortable. It's not because of any of you. It's getting rather warm. So let's just finish off. That way we get it done. I'm always a little worried that what if I don't get to do the Friday session? So I want to have at least one recording. I appreciate, though, you offering to watch it. So let's have a look what we can learn about chapter 14. I guess how I normally start this discussion when I talk with my students about brain and central nervous system is that, again, maybe a little bit of provokingly, that your brain is basically just a lump of fatty neurons. That's all it is. There's a bunch of neurons and they're covered with myelin to a large extent. So there's a lot of fatty tissue in that sense. It's not same as adipose tissue in elsewhere, but it is just a lump of neurons. But yet this lump of neurons is able to provide us really everything we are and everything that we experience. So that's a kind of interesting. Other thing that we see is that we have a huge amount of anatomical variation from one individual's brain to another, not just in case of those special cases that we just discussed about injuries or oddities, but we also see that even just alike people have differences in their brain anatomy. We do also see that certain structures, regardless of that, from one individual to another, are repeated in all of our brains. So lots of similarities, lots of differences. We're going to be focusing on what's common on all individuals. As we do so, I'm just going to mention this because if you haven't noticed already, one of the things that I do enjoy teaching my students is to talk a little bit about comparative anatomy and comparative physiology. Just let me grab another participant. Oh, I think we have just our previous participants joining us again. So what we see is that many animals have nervous systems, but how these nervous systems are organized differs significantly. We talked about the brain and how brain is especially characteristic for what we consider as more highly evolved animals in terms of our being the site where our personality, our memories, our dreams, our imagination, our wishes, our future hopes, all of those things are stored. But we see from earthworms to dolphins and so on, most animals have some kind of a nervous system. I guess if we look at really on a very, very small scale, if we look at on the scale of let me just check. Oh, I'm sorry that you lost internet. There was just a message. A few of our participants lost their internet. Please don't worry about it. I just said that we are having a sandstorm here as well, dust storm. So if I disappear, that's the same thing has happened to me. But just stay safe. But what I was saying is that what has made us more, I guess, highly evolved animals special is that our brain has developed quite far. And our brain has developed specific structures, specific regions that serve different purposes. If we look at this tree of evolutionary relationships, we'll see humans here kind of at the top right corner, and we're going to compare human brain to other animals. One of the things that's probably going to stand out for us from these diagrams is that human brain is unique in a sense that there's a lot of these ridges, these folds on the surface of the brain. And that is because the surface area of the brain is where it's at. That's the valuable, that's the important part of the brain. That's where, and I was just looking if I can find a piece of paper. I can from here. Most of the neurons, most of the cell bodies of the neurons are located on the surface of your brain. So surface of the brain is really where the thinking happens. So that's the gray matter, if you wish, of the brain. Inside the brain, you'll see something, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, that's known as a white matter, and that's just connecting parts. So human brain is characterized by having lots of those folds, and we'll unpack why in just a second. But the other thing that I wanted to show from this picture is that many animals, for example, if we compare ourselves to the sheep brains, have similar structures as humans have. But what's different is that we don't have those folds on the surface, and some areas are larger and some areas are smaller than those that we see on humans. For example, sheep rely greatly, and I guess our cats as well, rely greatly on their visual senses. So this area that's showing up here on this diagram on blue, which is our visual processing area, is much larger on these animals compared to the humans and human brain. Other areas like motor control, which is shown on red on this diagram, we find it also on cats, other animals. They need to move as well. We find it on sheep. Things like processing sounds, not as important, not as prevalent in some of the other animals. So we will be, and I think I have it on your learning module, in a face-to-face class, we would be dissecting sheep brain and kind of comparing and contrasting that with the human brain. In this online class, I've recorded a video for you where you see some of the most important structures of sheep brain. You don't have to watch it if that grosses you out. So what I was saying earlier on about what's unique for humans, let's unbundle that a little bit. Here, we're looking from the past and we're looking to the current human being. We're looking at what made human so successful. Well, first thing that we saw earlier on is that the anterior portion of the human brain increased compared to our evolutionary ancestors. So the front part of the brain grew significantly. Other thing that we will see is that the size of the brain also increased. So we needed to facilitate this. If we compare it to our early ancestors, human skull is rather large and contains a large brain. But the brain was growing and we needed to have that cortical area so much that we couldn't just keep growing brain uncontrollably. Our heads would have become too small, our skulls would have become too small. So what human evolution resulted to doing was to fold this cortical area, this outermost area, so we could pack much more of it on a much smaller area. And this is why we see those ridges and dendrites, those folds on the surface of the brain. We're just able to fit in a lot more surface area, which was where the thinking happened, on a smaller space by folding it down. So I guess that's what I wanted to say about that. So that's what I'm trying to show with this picture. If we compare to our ancestors, brains were smaller, frontal lobes were smaller, and they had less folds in those. Another thing that sometimes, and if this is not your jam, I won't be offended if you're not interested. I wanted to show also what happens during a lifetime and during early development of our. So before your birth, your brain will grow at a rapid rate. It actually starts your nervous system just as a neural tube that then starts folding and kind of developing into different areas until brain is present. and your brain grows at a fairly fast rate. Same thing continues after your birth up to that about 2 or 3 years, after which stage your brain growth rate slows down. And by the time you reach approximately 7 to 8 years, your brain is roughly done with most of its rapid growth. There will be still development. Your brain isn't fully developed until to your early 20s, when it comes especially to your frontal lobe. So frontal lobe is responsible for things like executive functions, decision making, planning. So we often say that we need to be a little bit more understanding with our kids because their brain is not yet fully developed. They don't yet fully understand what they're doing until they reach their early 20s. So I guess you shouldn't be making big decisions in your life until your brain is fully developed. Funnily enough, alcohol is one of the parts that starts to kind of inhibit the function of your frontal lobe. So I guess that's why we do stupid choices when we're consuming recreational drugs. So that's, I guess, what I wanted to say about the development of the brain. Do remember, though, that the brain keeps constantly rearranging and organizing. So even though it's not growing in size, your brain is constantly developing, constantly forming new connections between new neurons, forming new synapses. And that's what learning is, creating those new connections. Other thing that I wanted to talk about quickly in terms of the development of the brain is to look at different regions. So adult brain has really few different regions that we're going to talk about, and we can see those regions already early on in our development. So let's eye that a little bit. So here you see that neural tube that I mentioned that your nervous system starts developing at, and then approximately at week 5 after fertilization, we see that the neural tube starts enlarging at certain areas and bending at other areas. And we can see what will become specific parts of the brain as you grow up already at this stage. So this was at 5 weeks after fertilization. At 13 weeks, the parts have developed further, and we can start to see that it's starting to look like a brain, and with the brainstem and some of the other midbrain structures and so on. Let's have a look. So this was at 13 weeks. Let's have a look what brain would look like at birth. And this is a brain at birth, which is very close to the final appearance that we see in adults. So we can see a bunch of important structures. We can see the cerebral hemispheres, which are the two big sides that form the brain. This is what we see kind of on the outside. You see some structures on a paler color. Those are kind of inside there. You also see our diencephalon. Diencephalon is a portion kind of buried inside there. So that's why it's shown on this kind of transparent color. It's buried inside there. We see our brainstem. Our brainstem are green on this diagram. This is really the first part to develop of your brain. This is first part and also evolutionary sense that developed. And I guess that this is most important in a sense that this houses some of the vital functions like regulating your heart, regulating your breathing. So if we have an injury to a patient's brainstem, that's when we're really worried that they might not be able to self-sustain their body. Yes, injuries to the cerebral hemispheres will also impact us, but it won't impact our vital functions necessarily. And then we have our spinal cord continuing out from there. Final part that you see back here at the back of the head is what's known as our cerebellum. Cerebellum is sometimes also described as our little brain. And we'll unpack that as well during this chapter. Other thing that I wanted to show about the brain is in relation to what we just discussed about the outer and inner parts of the cerebral hemispheres especially. We see that the outer parts have these folds. So this is a kind of a cross section on a coronal plane of our brain. And we'll see that most of the inside of the brain is white matter. White matter is mainly myelinated axons. So these are pathways how we pass messages from one part of the brain to another. Whereas the outer part of the brain is gray matter. Gray matter is where we see those cell bodies located. So this is really where we do the processing of the information. Gray matter is called as such because it appears gray because there's no myelin. Myelin gives the white matter its white color. So when Sherlock Holmes says, if any of you reads or watches movies about Sherlock Holmes, that he needs to sit down and dig into his gray matter, what he means is that he's going to be doing some thinking because he's processing information, and the processing of information happened at the level of the gray matter of the cortex. So that's why gray matter is so important. That's why damages here would be so disastrous for us. I'm trying to think of, do I have anything that I have skipped from that? I think we're doing pretty well. Other thing that I'm just going to highlight here, what's kind of interesting in our spinal cord, the organization of gray and white matter kind of gets flipped around. And we'll talk about spinal cord a little bit more. You'll also see inside the brain empty spaces. And these empty spaces all connect to each other just in different planes than where we've cut the brain here. And they are filled with fluid. That's our cerebrospinal fluid, so CSF. And this fluid kind of nourishes the brain, these parts of the brain. These are really these empty spaces, what we call as ventricles. So these ventricles are lined now with ependymal cells. Remember those glial cells that formed kind of a barrier around important parts. Other thing that I might mention, and I don't think that it's the most important one, you'll also see that there are some distinctly more white parts of the brain where those messages pass from one brain part to another. For example, corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres of the brain is particularly important of that. We in fact see that back in the day when they did things like lobotomy, so to disable someone's brain, so to speak, those were the parts, those pathways connecting different parts of the brain that they damaged intentionally so that the person would not be anymore able to do brain function. I mentioned these ventricles, so let's have a look of a little bit of a better view of the ventricles. Here we see them inside the brain. They're filled with the cerebrospinal fluid that I mentioned. They form these continuous structures where the CSF is bathed at. So important in that sense. Next thing that I want to talk about is our cerebral hemispheres. Cerebral hemispheres represent about 83% of the total brain mass, so they're definitely important parts. They're these wiggly outer parts, if you wish, on two sides, right and left. Some terminology that we want to get familiar as we talk about those. Uri refer to these kind of ridges or bumps on the surface of the cerebral hemispheres. Sulci instead are shallow grooves running between these ridges. And then we have fissures, which are really, really, really deep grooves. Here we see one of the important grooves separating the two cerebral hemispheres. This is going to be our longitudinal fissure that separates the right and left hemisphere. Here we're looking down. Front would be here, back would be here, your right and left. So this is our longitudinal fissure. You will also see a transverse fissure that separated that little brain from the cerebral hemispheres, that separated our cerebellum that you can see here from the cerebral hemispheres. Next thing that I wanted to do, let's have a look of an actual real brain. And if you look at, I said that there's a huge amount of variation from one individual to another, but in addition to that, there's a lot of similarities from one person to another. And what's similar is that we see some of these crucial fissures separating different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, so different areas of that. We have our central sulcus, we have our lateral sulcus, we have our parieto-occipital sulcus, and we have our transverse cerebral fissure as well. And these lobes are what I want us to talk a little bit. So let's separate the different lobes separated by these fissures. So the first lobe that I want to talk about is the most anterior part. So the front of the face would be here, back of the face here, top and bottom. So the most anterior lobe, which is really prominent and large in humans, is known as our frontal. Frontal lobe is responsible for things like thinking and planning and executive functions. At the posterior portion of the frontal lobe, we also see our motor control located. Then we will see our parietal lobe. Our parietal lobe is responsible for things like sensory processing. We see sensory regions kind of right opposite to the motor regions. So that's an important. We'll see our temporal lobe. Temporal lobe is responsible for things like processing language, so hearing and speech as well. And then at the very back, at the very posterior portion, we see our occipital lobe, which is responsible for visual processing. There is a fifth lobe that's hidden kind of inside between the temporal lobe and frontal lobe. You would have to kind of pull the brain apart to see, and that's known as our insula. That's deeper lobe inside. We won't be talking about it on this course. So one of the things that you might be noticing here is that all the work that you put in to learn the different bones that made up the skull become useful now because they are literally guiding how we name the different lobes of the cerebral hemispheres. And one game that I sometimes play with my students in a class is that I ask them that if you had to give up one of your lobes, which lobes would you give up? Hopefully none of us has to do that. But that might be an interesting consideration if you're looking for discussion forum topic. Which of these areas, based on their functions, would you be willing to give up? I also wanted to highlight two specific areas of the cerebral hemispheres. Here we see again our brain with the different lobes, but I've highlighted two parts. Let's start with Broca's area. Broca's area is responsible for your speech production, whereas the area further back that I've highlighted is our Wernicke's area, which is responsible for speech comprehension. So you can see that there's a little bit of, again, this localization of functions. We see that, for example, for understanding speech, we want to recruit our temporal lobe, but we also want to recruit portions of our parietal lobe. For speech production, it's the frontal lobe largely, some motor contribution as well. So these are the areas, if you damaged, that would affect either your ability to speak, produce speech, or understand speech. So again, those injuries as a way of learning, or brain imaging that shows that those areas are active when we do these functions. Another thing that I'm not going to talk about now, but that's mentioned in your lecture materials, is the lateralization of the cerebral hemisphere. Some people believe that right and left-hand side function very differently and do different functions. And some people say that individuals are either left or right brain dominant. So whether certain functions are their strength or not. So those classifications often describe as the right hemisphere focused more on language and math and logic, whereas left hemisphere more about visual, spatial skills, intuition, emotion, artistic, and musical skills. These classifications have not been proven undisputably, so I encourage you to approach them a little bit with some reservations about being right and left-brained, but they are not totally without lack of some suggestion either. So there's some more work that needs to be happening. And obviously there's nerve tracts that connect the two lobes together as well. Well, next thing that I wanted to talk about is our diencephalon. This is the part inside the brain. And we'll also have a look of the brainstem in just a second. Let's have a look of diencephalon and few parts of the diencephalon deep inside the brain. So we see structures. The first structure that I wanted to highlight is our thalamus. Thalamus, kind of an egg-shaped portion there, blob. We will see a thalamus on both sides. And here we see fibers that communicate with the cerebral cortex. Thalamus often serves as kind of a relay station for incoming information, sorting, editing, and also relaying it onwards. We see some amount of controlling of things like emotions, your visceral functions, direct motor functions, and also integration of your memory and sensory inputs, kind of creating these whole experiences in your body. The second part that I wanted to highlight here is going to be our hypothalamus. It literally means hypo, underneath, thalamus. So this is the part underneath the thalamus. Hypothalamus is important for things like, for example, as a smell relay station. But what's really important, and you'll see this on your BIO201 course, is that immediately underneath the hypothalamus is where you'll find the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is responsible for a lot of regulation of your endocrine system, so it's going to become important in that sense as well. So hypothalamus is often described as controlling your hormones, controlling your endocrine system. Other things that we can associate with hypothalamus is kind of as a regulation center for homeostasis. So things like regulating your blood pressure, heart rate, digestive tract, pupil size. Physical responses to emotions are also housed here. Things like body temperature regulation, your hunger, feeling full, thirst, sleep, contributing also. And like I said, that big role in endocrine system. The final portion that I do want to mention from here is our epithalamus. Epithalamus includes, for example, our pineal gland, which is a small gland, and you'll see that if you look at that video of the sheep brain dissection, this is a gland that's responsible for secreting melatonin, which is responsible for regulating our sleep-wake cycle. So a bunch of interesting structures there to notice from this set of or this region of the brain. And I wanted to keep moving onwards and talk about the brainstem. From the brainstem, we see a few different portions. We see our midbrain, this is kind of inside the brain. We see our pons, which is the first blob, if you wish. And then we see our medulla oblongata, often described. Our midbrain, again, an important relay station. Pons does things like regulate your breathing rhythm. Medulla, instead, things like equilibrium relay station, controlling a lot of our reflexes, heart rate, blood vessel diameter, breathing, hiccups, vomiting, swallowing, coughing, sneezing, things like that, controlled from there. So that's our brainstem. Let's have a look of cerebellum next. So cerebellum was our little brain, if you wish to describe it as such. It represents about 11% of the brain mass, responsible for coordination of your movements and balance. Located inside the cerebellum, if we cut it in half, we will see this tract of white pathways. It almost looks like a tree inside the cerebellum. And in fact, the Latin name Arbor Vitae means the tree of life. So you'll see that located there as well. So that was all that I was planning to say about different parts of the brain. Next time when we meet, we will continue and we will talk, for example, of the spinal cord as a continuation. Oh, I lost my mouse. As a continuation of the brainstem. So this brings me to end of everything that I wanted to highlight. Like I said, I do have a lot of stories, a lot of other things, if anyone's particularly interested. For example, how epilepsy works as uncoordinated neural impulses on your brain, how we can manage that not only with drugs, but also with surgery and so on. So if you have any particular questions or things that you're interested, I'm happy to chat here. I'm happy to chat on those discussion forums. But that's the end of what I had kind of planned as a review of our chapter material. I know it's been a ton of material again, and I thank everyone who's been present here, who's stuck around through it. I hope it's been helpful. And like always, I really, really do appreciate you being part of this class. And remember, even if it's not in this setting, my job and my role is to help you. So let me know how I can assist you. But that's it for today. If you have no questions, you can just carry on. I hope you have a very good long weekend. I hope the amount of work is a little lesser and you get to relax and enjoy the summer a little bit. And I appreciate you so much. Thank you for being part of this class again. I'll stay around if anyone.
I saw that in the chat, someone had asked a question if you were teaching the bio class in the fall. I missed that answer.
No.
Are you teaching in the fall?
That's a good question. So I'm going to answer the best way I can, and please feel free to ask if I don't answer clearly enough. I'm just being careful so I don't get into trouble since I'm recording. I'm happy to teach any courses that students want me to teach. I can teach any courses that students want me to teach. At the moment, I'm not scheduled to teach 201 or 202 online. I was scheduled to teach 202 in person, but I'm going to be honest, at the moment, it looks like we're going to staff another instructor there just to make sure that they have teaching as well and they can teach. But if students would like me to teach something, the best way to make that happen is by contacting my boss and telling that, hey, he's not planning to teach or he's not scheduled to teach any sections, but here is where students would like him to teach at. And how to get hold of my boss, I'll share her contact details on Canvas through an announcement. But again, I would maybe ask in a most polite way that I wouldn't necessarily say that Sam told me to tell you that you need to let him teach this. It might not be a good look for me. But if you express that there's an interest to have a certain teacher teaching a certain course, we can totally make that happen.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, you're just like an amazing professor. So I would love to, like, if I had the opportunity, take your class again. So I will for sure reach out to her.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, and I will promise that I will teach whatever you want me to teach. I will teach it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you. If anyone has other questions, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, that's it. So there's a question in the chat about the in-person 202 class, and I kind of feel a little hesitant to say for sure, but yes, I was scheduled to teach in-person 202. We have had some changes in our faculty, and at the moment we have moved me away from teaching that and staffed someone else there. It doesn't mean that it couldn't change back again, but at the moment, unfortunately, I'm not scheduled to teach that course where my name was earlier on. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. If you would like me to teach that, again, I would encourage you to message to my boss and say that, hey, I signed up to this class and I see there's been a change of instructors. Are you sure? Can we do some changes? I would like to take a class with him, and I will totally try to make that happen. It's not that I don't want to teach that. It's more of that we have to offer our all of our faculty chances to teach. Otherwise, they don't have a job. To contact my bosses, I will share on announcements their contact details on our courses, campus announcements. I'll share them. I'll probably try to be somewhat vague. So I say that, hey, if you have any positive or negative things, let them know. And I promise that I am open to teach whatever you want me to teach. And if there's interest, we'll shuffle things around and we'll make it happen. But I will be honest, we have also amazing teachers, others as well. It's just finding the fit and finding what works for you. Well, that's great if you can message them. I appreciate it. And that's all I have. If you don't have anything else, you're free to go, but you're also free to say we can chat. Thank you for joining. I know it was another long session, but I promise the workload will be lighter. Have a great day. Bye. And on that note, we will finish our recording also for this session. As always, I appreciate you. I don't want you to feel that I'm ignoring students who are joining us through a recording. You're a valuable and important part of our class. I understand these times don't always work for everyone. So we will find a way, and I think that this recording is a good way for you to still participate. So I enjoy your weekend. Have a good weekend, and I look forward to seeing you on our forums, on our virtual learning spaces, and continuing our great collaborations there. Until next time, thank you and bye.